Lucas Nolan had never imagined that returning to the house he once visited every summer as a child would feel more like retreating to a battlefield than coming home. The single-story, ranch-style property on Morrow Lane had belonged to his uncle, a quiet man who passed away 2 years earlier, leaving behind a modest, aging home with a cracked driveway, overgrown shrubs, and a lawn that hadn't seen a proper mow in months. Lucas had inherited it unexpectedly while recovering from spinal surgery, an operation that left him paralyzed from the waist down and suddenly facing a new reality defined by ramps, reach, and rethinking every movement. The house, though outdated, came with something far more valuable than any architectural feature: no mortgage. And for Lucas, a 42-year-old freelance designer with no dependents, limited savings, and a deep need for stability, that alone made the place priceless. He had the ramp built the same week he moved in. It wasn't just a practical decision, it was symbolic. A wide, concrete structure stretching from the front porch to the driveway, with reinforced handrails and a gentle slope that met ADA compliance to the inch. Watching the contractors finish it gave Lucas a feeling he hadn't experienced in over a year: autonomy. For months after the surgery, he had relied on hospital staff, physical therapists, and assisted living aides who did everything with sterile professionalism, but no warmth. Now, rolling down this newly poured surface, wind on his face, surrounded by nothing but the rustling of dry trees and the chirps of faraway birds, he finally felt the ground beneath him again. Metaphorically, at least. The neighborhood, Maple Glen Estates, looked ordinary on paper. Rows of middle-class homes with neatly trimmed lawns, uniform mailboxes, and a sense of enforced tidiness that made you instinctively lower your voice as you drove through. Lucas didn't remember it being this polished when he was a kid, but then again, he hadn't paid attention to such things when running through sprinklers or racing bicycles down the sidewalk with his cousin. Now, every manicured hedge and freshly painted curb looked like a warning. This place didn't tolerate change. His ramp, though legally compliant and medically necessary, was already standing out. It didn't match the old woodwork of the porch. It cut through the grass, and it didn't ask permission. He noticed her the second day. Karen Bradley. She lived directly across the street in a house that seemed to glisten unnaturally white in the sunlight. Its windows always closed, curtains always stiff. Her SUV parked precisely in line with her walkway, not an inch askew. She wasn't someone you'd miss, even if you tried. Stocky, broad-shouldered, with a permanent frown etched into her face like it was carved there by years of scrutinizing neighbors and rewriting yard codes in her head. She had short, tightly curled hair that didn't move in the wind and a habit of standing on her porch with arms crossed, as if guarding the moral integrity of the block. She didn't wave when Lucas caught her staring, didn't smile, didn't blink, just watched, cold, quiet, assessing. At first, Lucas dismissed her as another nosy neighbor with too much time on her hands and an unhealthy interest in other people's property. The kind who would report you to some local board if your garbage bins were left out half a day too long or your grass grew half an inch past the approved height. But then, things started happening. It began subtly. A pair of ceramic planters appeared overnight at the foot of his ramp. At first glance, they looked decorative. Large, red clay pots filled with yellow daisies, arranged symmetrically like some HOA-approved centerpiece. Except they weren't symmetrical to the porch. They were symmetrical to the ramp, placed precisely at the base where his wheels would have to turn. He thought maybe they'd been misplaced or dropped off by mistake. Maybe someone thought they were helping. So he moved them a few feet aside. The next morning, they were back. Only this time, heavier. Filled with dark soil, planted deeper, and wedged closer together. Still, Lucas said nothing. He wasn't trying to start a war with a stranger. He simply nudged them aside again and went about his day. By the third time, it was no longer a misunderstanding. The planters now included a small iron fence segment nestled between them, not fixed into the ground, but leaning upright with the help of plastic garden stakes. It didn't block the ramp completely, but it forced him to turn awkwardly, dangerously even if he wanted to exit. It was enough to trigger his back pain again, which he had worked so hard to stabilize during recovery. That night, as he stared at the silhouette of the planters from the living room window, a quiet anger began to simmer in his chest. It wasn't rage, not yet, but it was the knowledge that someone had looked at his condition, seen his adjustments, and decided to make his life deliberately harder. That was no accident. That was malice. He went to Karen's door the next morning. Not to accuse. Not yet. Just to ask. He rolled across the street, knocked politely, and waited. She opened after a long pause, looked at him with pursed lips, and didn't greet him. "Hi, I'm Lucas, from across the street. I wanted to ask if those planters at the foot of my ramp, are they yours?" he asked evenly. She folded her arms, leaned against the doorframe. "They're on community property." Lucas blinked. "Sorry?" She nodded toward the sidewalk that ran just a few inches past the bottom of the ramp. "That space is public. I thought it could use some beautifying. This neighborhood has a standard." Lucas bit his tongue. "I get that, but I use that ramp to get in and out of my home. They're in the way." "They're not blocking anything," she said firmly, her voice dry. "You just don't want flowers near your concrete." He tried not to show frustration. "I don't mind flowers. I mind not being able to safely use my own access point." Karen smiled for the first time, a slow, patronizing smile that didn't touch her eyes. "Then maybe you should have considered aesthetics when you poured a slab down the middle of your lawn." The door closed. Just like that, Lucas sat there for a full minute, staring at the chipped white paint on her porch, his wheels locked, hands tight on the push rims. The whole exchange had felt surreal, as if she hadn't spoken to him as a person, but as an intruder, not because of his presence, but because of his difference. He didn't belong in her curated landscape, and she wanted him to know that. Back home, he spent hours researching local access laws, not because he didn't know them, but because he needed to feel grounded, needed to remind himself he wasn't crazy. What she was doing, if it continued, was a direct violation of access rights. But he also knew the burden of proof was always on the person affected. And when the offense came in the form of pots and flowers, it was easy to downplay, easy to ignore, easy to laugh off. But Lucas wasn't laughing, because Karen wasn't just placing obstacles. She was sending a message, and whether she realized it or not, Lucas was not the man to send messages to without expecting one back. Lucas had expected resistance. Maybe a few sideways glances or passive-aggressive notes slipped into his mailbox. But what unfolded over the next 3 days surpassed even his cautious expectations. The planters at the foot of his ramp remained unmoved despite the fact he had shifted them again the night before. They had not only returned to their original position, but were now joined by 2 additional pots. Massive, square, concrete-based containers that couldn't be nudged without a dolly and a strong back. This time, they were filled with thick, dense soil and topped with decorative river stones, a layer of polished weight that added both aesthetic and defensive function. It was obvious now. These were not for gardening. These were barricades, and someone wanted to make damn sure they weren't easy to remove. Lucas stared at them from the top of his ramp with a detached calm that masked the slow churn of disbelief and outrage. This was deliberate, strategic, and the precision with which they had been placed, edge to edge, suggested either measuring tape or a very practiced eye. They were aligned perfectly with the ramp's incline, forming a visual wall that would impress anyone unfamiliar with the intent. To anyone passing by, it looked like landscape decoration. But Lucas knew better. These were weapons disguised as flowers. He called the local precinct again, more firmly this time. Officer Salgado was dispatched, a younger cop who looked no older than 25, polite but clearly reluctant to involve himself in what he likely viewed as neighborhood pettiness. Lucas explained the issue in full. The obstruction, the conversation with Karen, and the mobility hazard these planters posed. Salgado examined the scene, took a few photos, and finally said, "They're technically on the sidewalk edge. I can't make her move them unless they're proven to be a hazard." Lucas's voice tightened. "How much more hazard do you need? You want to watch me try to ram through this and crack a vertebrae?" Salgado looked genuinely uneasy but held up his hands in resignation. "If it happens again, if there's damage or injury, then I can file a report. Until then, you might want to talk to the Municipal Code Office. They're the ones who regulate sidewalk use. I wish I could do more." He left Lucas with a brochure, the kind that local departments printed to appear helpful while sidestepping actual responsibility. It was full of generic information on accessibility, neighborhood disputes, and a phone number that rang 3 times before redirecting to voicemail. That night, Lucas stayed up late, not out of insomnia, but focus. He couldn't sleep knowing he was being pushed, slowly, subtly, maliciously, into retreat. The next morning, he rolled down the ramp as he always did, forcing the wheels forward with a bit more determination than usual, and gently bumped one of the concrete planters with his front tires. It didn't budge. He rolled back, repositioned, and drove straight forward again, applying force. This time, one of the pots rocked slightly, but the angle was wrong, and the stone edging on the ramp scraped hard against his wheel hub. He didn't push further, not because of fear, because of control. She wanted him to lose it. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction. Instead, he documented. He measured the clearance of the sidewalk. He called the city planner's office, left a detailed message explaining the obstruction of a medical access ramp. He emailed the photos to 3 departments: public safety, city engineering, and even parks and landscaping, just in case jurisdiction bounced around like it usually did in local government. He received 2 automatic responses. Nothing else. By the end of the week, Lucas had adopted a new pattern. He would roll down his ramp, nudge the planters aside by inches, not enough to draw damage, just enough to create a narrow path, and then go about his errands. On his return, they were always back in place. Identical alignment, as though they had never been touched. On Friday, he left a small note tucked into one of the pots. Stop. Nothing else. Direct, neutral, firm. The next day, he found something else in return. A paper sign taped to the front of his mailbox. Neighborhood character matters. We all have to do our part. Karen's handwriting was unmistakable. Tight, cursive, blue ink, a looped R and overconfident slashes through her T's. He removed the note calmly and didn't respond. But inside, something began to twist. This wasn't a territorial dispute anymore. This was about punishment, about pushing him out of sight. His ramp broke the line. His presence disrupted her curated illusion. She wasn't just offended. She was on a mission. On Sunday evening, he returned from the pharmacy to find not just pots, but garden stakes and string strung between them, forming a waist-high line across the bottom of the ramp. It was absurd, laughable even, like a toddler's idea of a barrier. But it wasn't meant to stop him physically. It was symbolic, a declaration. This was not his space, and if he wanted to pass, he'd have to choose. Run it over and become the aggressor, or comply and retreat. Lucas ran it over. The string snapped with a sharp twang. The stakes popped out of the soil, and the back wheels of his chair scattered the rocks underfoot like seeds. One pot tilted but didn't fall. He didn't look back. But for the first time, he realized something chilling. Karen wasn't just toying with him. She was recording his responses. Not literally, perhaps, but socially, cataloging who looked, who commented, who stayed silent. She was gathering social credit from the other neighbors, slowly spinning her story. That Lucas was aggressive, combative, a troublemaker. He knew the type. He'd seen them in every city he'd ever lived in. People who weaponized civility, who turned the rules into bricks and built walls with them, smiling the entire time. That night, someone dumped a thin layer of mulch across the top of the ramp. It wasn't thick, but it was fresh, damp, slippery, and layered so precisely that it almost looked intentional. Lucas discovered it as he opened the door, prepared to roll down. His brakes locked just in time to keep him from sliding. He sat in silence for nearly a minute. Then he called a cleaning service. Not the city, not the neighborhood board, a private company. He didn't leave a note. He didn't file a complaint. He didn't answer Karen's gaze from across the street when she watched the crew clear the ramp in 20 minutes flat. He just sat in his kitchen window, sipping coffee, and watched the pile disappear. On Monday, he contacted a disability rights advocacy group. He didn't ask them to intervene. He asked for a legal interpretation of obstruction laws specific to sidewalk-adjacent private ramps. The representative, a woman named Merrill with a calm but steel-edged voice, said, "Do not file anything yet. Document everything. We'll advise you on the threshold for federal involvement if it continues. But don't escalate. Not yet." That last part stayed with him. Not yet. The same day, he found an envelope in his mailbox. No postage, no name. Inside was a printed page, a copy of a neighborhood regulation from nearly 15 years ago, marked in yellow. No semi-permanent structures may protrude into the communal line of sight from street-facing homes. Underlined in red pen was the phrase, "communal line of sight." Lucas smiled bitterly. She was stretching definitions now, mining the past to legitimize her campaign. But it was the inclusion of the regulation, not its meaning, that revealed the next phase. She was preparing to take it further. He knew what was coming. She'd file a complaint officially. She'd rally support. Maybe even propose a revision to the community's design standards. She wouldn't name him at first. Just talk in abstractions. Visual flow. Neighborhood harmony. But eventually, she'd make it personal, and by then she'd try to isolate him so thoroughly he'd have to either surrender the ramp or abandon the house. What she didn't know was that Lucas had grown up around people like her, people who loved order more than justice, people who disguised cruelty in floral arrangements and smiled while shoving you off balance. What she didn't know was that this house, this ramp, this tiny stretch of independence, it wasn't something he was willing to give up. Not again. And certainly not to her. 3 days later, Lucas found himself staring down at the remnants of what used to be his morning routine, now twisted beyond recognition by a war he hadn't started, but was being forced to fight with increasing precision. The planters had returned once more, but this time they weren't merely placed, they were staked down. Each of the 4 ceramic blocks, now larger than ever and filled with thick, dark soil that smelled faintly of ammonia, was drilled to a foundation of concrete tiles laid beneath them during the night. Someone had dug up the grass just enough to seat the tiles flush with the earth, cleanly and deliberately, as if preparing a monument. It wasn't just an obstruction anymore, it was a permanent fixture, a statement. Lucas wheeled himself closer, tracing the line of fresh soil with his eyes, and felt something tighten deep in his chest. Not fear, not even anger, but the awareness of strategy. Whoever did this wasn't improvising. They were calculating, measuring, waiting for his next move. And it wasn't just Karen anymore, he realized. She might be the orchestrator, but someone had helped her lay those foundations. Maybe a landscaper, maybe a compliant neighbor who owed her a favor or feared her disapproval, or maybe, and this thought disturbed him most, someone who genuinely agreed with her, who thought a wheelchair ramp on a residential street was a visual scar on their idea of uniformity. He was no longer dealing with a petty neighbor. This had become coordinated suppression. He didn't call the city. Not this time. He'd already memorized the sound of their voicemail system. Instead, he called someone else, Merrill from the advocacy group. Her voice, when she answered, was calm, but immediately alert. Lucas explained what he saw, how the planters were now effectively fixtures, how the access ramp was once again blocked entirely. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't speculate. He gave her precise measurements and emailed photos within the hour. There was a pause on her end before she responded. "You need to file a formal ADA interference complaint now. We'll assist, but you need documentation from a certified inspector to establish the hazard officially. And Lucas," she added, "don't touch anything. Not yet. Let them hang themselves first." So he didn't touch them. Not the planters, not the string someone had hung between them like a sad parody of fencing, and not the new sign staked in the ground beside the ramp, which read, "Please use main walkway. Decorative display in progress." The words were passive. The message was not. There was no main walkway. His house didn't have stairs anymore, only the ramp. And this decorative display had been designed specifically to strip him of independence. Lucas stared at the sign until his neck stiffened, then rolled backward up the ramp, entered the house, and made a call to a private ADA-certified property assessor. He paid out of pocket. No discounts. No insurance. He scheduled them for Friday morning. That night, Karen was on her porch again. Same folded arms, same stance, same stare. But this time, she wasn't alone. A neighbor stood with her. An older man Lucas recognized but had never spoken to. They didn't say a word as Lucas exited his house and attempted to maneuver past the planters. He didn't acknowledge them either, but he felt their eyes, the weight of passive judgment pressing against the back of his neck like static. He made it past the line of pots, barely, scraping his wheel against the edge of one and twisting his wrist awkwardly. He didn't let the pain show, didn't slow, just kept moving, and when he returned the sign was gone, replaced with a laminated flyer duct taped to his mailbox. Ramp area under community review. Alterations may be necessary to preserve neighborhood unity. There was no signature. There didn't need to be. When the inspector arrived, she didn't hide her reaction. A woman in her late 40s with weather-beaten hands and the blunt tone of someone who'd done this too many times, she took one look at the setup and muttered, "Jesus Christ." She examined the anchoring method, took high-resolution photos, measured the ramp's slope, clearance, surface traction, and spatial access zones. She photographed the proximity of the pots to the turning radius. She didn't speak much, just worked. After 20 minutes, she handed Lucas a form. "This is a Class 2 obstruction under state ADA interpretation. You'll need to file this with municipal code enforcement. I've notarized the findings. If they don't act, we escalate to the federal level." He thanked her. She didn't smile. "People like her," she said quietly as she loaded her equipment. "They count on silence. You're doing the right thing. Just don't do it alone." Lucas didn't sleep that night. He kept the lights off and sat in the dark living room, listening. Waiting. And at 3:14 a.m. he heard the sound. A low rumble, rubber on gravel, a vehicle slowing to a stop. He peeked through the blinds and saw a pickup truck idling across the street. It was unmarked, older model, with 2 figures inside. They didn't exit. They just sat. 15 minutes passed. Then the engine revved and the truck pulled away. The next morning, Lucas found his trash bin overturned and his recycling spilled across the driveway. One of the planter pots had been rotated 30 degrees. Not enough to notice from the street, but enough to knock his wheel alignment if he approached at the wrong angle. It wasn't random. It was message warfare. He sent the incident log to Merrill. She replied within the hour. "You're being baited. Don't engage. Our legal team is filing a preliminary interference suit. Stay the course. We'll notify you once we submit." Lucas felt a strange mix of relief and weariness. Someone was finally helping. But every hour in that house still felt like a siege. Every time he rolled down the ramp, his hand hovered over his phone, expecting a confrontation, a new obstacle, a stranger with a clipboard knocking on his door, asking about compliance. On Saturday morning, it escalated again. Not with soil, not with pots, but with construction. Lucas awoke to the sound of hammering. He looked outside to see 2 men erecting a lattice fence, waist-high, painted white, along the edge of the sidewalk on Karen's side. It extended across her lawn, but also bent toward the shared sidewalk, creating a funnel effect that forced pedestrians to divert away from his ramp's path. Lucas rolled out to confront them, and one of the workers handed him a printed permit. "Temporary installation," the man said. "Community beautification project." Lucas examined the document. It looked legitimate. Stamped, dated, signed by someone on the neighborhood committee. He recognized the name. Not Karen's, another resident. He said nothing and returned inside. He didn't call the city this time either. He called a lawyer. It took 3 hours and 8 rejections before he found one willing to take on the case without a $5,000 retainer. But when he did, he finally felt like he was no longer shadow boxing. The lawyer, a man named Trent Malone, specialized in accessibility violations and had handled over a dozen similar cases in the past year. He was blunt, sharp-tongued, and methodical. "First rule," he said, "no contact with her, not a word. You speak through me now. Second, I want timestamps. Every interference, every variation, every noise outside your house past midnight. You log it, you photograph it, and you send it to me. Third, and this is important, we don't go nuclear yet. Let her keep escalating. The more she does, the stronger our position becomes." Lucas agreed. Trent ended the call with a dry chuckle. "I've dealt with Karens before. The trick isn't out-shouting them, it's outlasting them. And you, my friend, have already won half the war just by not breaking." That night, Lucas found the entire ramp covered in birdseed. Not an accident. It glittered under the moonlight, scattered in lines, designed to draw pests, and, if possible, make the surface slick. He stood at the top, staring down at the mess, and then simply laughed. Not loud, not angry, just a slow, disbelieving laugh that echoed quietly through the night. He turned around, rolled inside, and made 2 phone calls, one to his lawyer and one to the local animal control office. The next morning, when Karen came out and saw 2 city workers examining her lawn and taking samples, she finally blinked. And Lucas? He didn't even look up from his coffee. The first indication that the tide was beginning to shift came not from a legal letter or an official decision, but from silence. An unusual, heavy absence of interference that persisted for nearly 48 hours. For 2 days, the planters remained untouched. No string, no mulch, no signs. The bird seed had been swept and bagged by city sanitation after the animal control inspection, and though Karen still stood on her porch in her usual pose, she didn't speak, didn't glare, didn't even glance toward Lucas. It was the stillness that unnerved him most. After weeks of unrelenting tactics, barriers disguised as decor, whispered complaints, carefully staged escalation, the sudden pause felt unnatural, as if something new was brewing just beneath the surface. Lucas didn't lower his guard. If anything, he became sharper, more attuned to pattern shifts, more precise in his documentation. He kept daily logs, updated his lawyer, and forwarded every piece of correspondence, no matter how minor. Even the casual flyer that appeared on everyone's doorstep, "Join the upcoming neighborhood unity and aesthetics discussion," was logged, scanned, and analyzed for its underlying intent. Then came the meeting. It was scheduled for 7 p.m. in the Community Recreation Center, a low, square building with flickering fluorescent lights and that faint smell of dust and disinfectant that always lingered in underused public spaces. Lucas debated whether to attend. Trent, his lawyer, had advised against it, warning him that anything said could be twisted, misquoted, or used out of context. But Meryl from the advocacy group had a different perspective. "Presence," she said over the phone, "is sometimes more powerful than protest. Sit in silence. Let them talk themselves into a corner." And so Lucas arrived 5 minutes early, wearing a dark jacket and seated near the center aisle, making no attempt to hide his expression or his wheels. He didn't greet anyone. He didn't scan the room for allies. He simply sat and waited. The discussion began predictably, with vague mentions of neighborhood cohesion, a desire to maintain architectural continuity, and an unspoken yet omnipresent implication that something, or someone, was jeopardizing that balance. Karen didn't speak immediately. She waited. Let the others build the stage for her entrance. Finally, when the moderator opened the floor, she stood. Lucas didn't turn his head, but he recognized the cadence of her voice, measured, authoritative, laced with faux concern. "I think we all appreciate the need for accessibility," she said, her eyes casually scanning the room without landing on him. "But we also have to consider the visual impact of permanent structural modifications on shared neighborhood presentation. There are ways to accommodate without altering the character of our homes. We just need better dialogue." It was well played, neutral in tone, devoid of overt hostility, but Lucas could feel the real message humming just beneath the surface. Accommodations are fine, so long as they're invisible, so long as they don't disturb the aesthetic uniformity that Karen had made her life's mission. What she wanted was for him to move the ramp, or better yet, move out. But she wouldn't say it directly. That wasn't her style. She spoke in policy, in bylaws, in euphemisms that cloaked exclusion in the language of harmony. Several heads nodded in vague agreement. A few others glanced toward Lucas, uncertain, perhaps wondering how much they were allowed to acknowledge without disrupting the carefully maintained performance. Then someone spoke up, a woman, mid-50s, seated near the exit. "I just want to say," she began, her voice low but steady, "that I walk past that house every morning. The ramp isn't an eyesore. It's concrete. It's clean. It's safer than half the sidewalks in this place. What's the real issue here?" The room tensed. Karen's expression remained composed, but her posture shifted slightly. The woman continued, "If we're talking about visual harmony, maybe we should start with the fluorescent flags hanging from garage doors or the inflatable animals in December, not a ramp for someone who actually needs it." That single statement cracked the veneer. Karen sat down, not replying, and the moderator stumbled through a quick deflection about keeping things constructive. Lucas didn't speak. He didn't need to. He stayed until the end, met no one's eyes, and left without a sound. The next morning, he noticed a change in Karen's yard. 2 of the planters were gone. The remaining ones had been shifted back several inches, just enough to allow full turning clearance at the base of the ramp. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a concession. It was a strategic withdrawal, an attempt to de-escalate without acknowledging wrongdoing. Lucas understood it immediately. She wasn't retreating. She was recalibrating. Sure enough, 3 days later, a letter arrived from the neighborhood committee. Not an official violation, but a recommendation, suggesting that all residents with non-standard structural features consult with the new Visual Compliance Subcommittee. It was a newly invented body. Unofficial, advisory in nature, and without legal power. But Lucas saw the trap for what it was. Bait. If he responded, they'd initiate a paper trail, establish a precedent, and pull him into a cycle of bureaucratic negotiation. So he did what Trent advised. Nothing. He let the letter sit unopened on the edge of the kitchen table, photographed it, archived it, and ignored it. For a brief time, things quieted again. But the atmosphere had changed. The neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid him now offered brief nods. A man on the corner waved one morning. Another neighbor paused to ask if he needed help reaching a dropped glove. The shift wasn't dramatic, but it was tangible. Karen still watched. Still stood sentinel. But her circle had cracked just slightly. She was no longer speaking for everyone. And Lucas no longer felt entirely alone. But peace was never her endgame. Because late one evening, as Lucas returned from a grocery run, he found a series of large plastic bins stacked near the ramp. City-issue compost containers. 5 of them. He didn't remember ordering them. He hadn't requested new bins. He checked the labels. All bore his address. Inside, they were filled with soft, damp mulch, yard waste, and something else. Scraps of wood, shards of ceramic, and fragments of what looked like an old flower bed border. Decorative pieces, but jagged, misplaced, dangerous. Someone had requested a bulk pickup under his name. Someone had wanted to create a scene of disarray, make it look like he was hoarding trash in public view. Another setup. He didn't call the city this time. He waited, and sure enough, an anonymous complaint was filed 2 days later, claiming unsanitary conditions, improper storage, and public obstruction. Trent responded before Lucas even had to lift a finger. Let her push, let her file. Every step she takes digs the hole deeper. Just keep watching. Keep documenting. She's moving out of strategy now. This is desperation. She's starting to lose control. And for the first time since the first planter appeared, Lucas believed it. Lucas had long suspected that Karen Bradley wasn't just acting out of personal irritation, but something deeper, more instinctive. A pathological aversion to control slipping from her fingers. Her need to dominate every inch of the street's aesthetic was not about beauty, nor even order, but about command. Every mailbox color, hedge height, and seasonal wreath was a chess piece on a board she believed she owned, and the presence of his ramp, his freedom to exist on his own terms, was the one thing she could not move. And so, like any losing tyrant, she doubled down. Lucas discovered the next phase of her campaign not through confrontation or message, but through the subtle weapon of bureaucracy. That Monday morning, he received a packet from the city's zoning department, thick and bureaucratic, informing him that his ramp, the very one installed with a licensed contractor, compliant with both state and federal guidelines, was being reviewed for nonconformance following multiple residential complaints. No signature, no name, just a stamp, a return address, and an official tone that sent a chill up his spine. Trent, his attorney, read it over and exhaled through his nose. This is manufactured. Nothing in this letter holds up unless someone upstream has been pressured hard. Lucas asked what to do. We don't blink, Trent said. We demand a hearing, on record, with your inspector's report and ADA compliance documents. If they stall, we go to state level. If they push harder, we escalate federally. But let's see how far they're willing to bluff. Lucas agreed, but inside he knew this wasn't about city zoning. It was about getting the system to do what Karen herself couldn't, squeeze him out without touching him. The next week passed with no new incidents on the surface, but something in the rhythm of the street had shifted. Conversation stopped when Lucas passed. A previously friendly neighbor turned away mid-wave. The teenage boy who once offered to shovel snow now hurried by with his earbuds in and his head down. She was working behind the scenes now, poisoning the atmosphere. His home had become the house that started trouble. His ramp had become the symbol of division. It wasn't about pots anymore. It was about dominance. She couldn't win with flowers, so she was using whispers. And then, as expected, came the false emergency. It happened on a Wednesday morning. Lucas had just finished transferring groceries from his adapted vehicle when the police arrived. 3 cruisers, no sirens, but lights flashing soft blue against his driveway. The officers stepped out slowly, hands visible, expressions unreadable. One of them, a middle-aged officer with tired eyes and a radio crackling on his shoulder, approached Lucas as he sat in his chair beside the rear lift. "Sir," he said, voice neutral but firm. "We received a report of potential hazardous waste being stored on this property. We're required to inspect the area under Municipal Code 518C. Lucas stared at him blankly, then laughed once, dry and bitter. "Hazardous waste? You mean grass clippings and broken flower pots?" The officer didn't answer. He nodded toward the back gate. "We'd like to take a quick look if you'll allow it." Lucas knew refusal would only escalate. He wheeled to the side, unlocked the gate, and watched silently as the 3 men performed a cursory walk-through, pausing at the compost bins and old bagged mulch. After 10 minutes, they returned. "There's nothing hazardous here," one officer muttered. "We'll file it as resolved." But the damage had already been done. 3 patrol cars parked in front of his house, neighbors watching through blinds. Karen on her porch, expressionless, arms folded. A silent headline forming in their minds. Police visit wheelchair guy's house again. Lucas closed the gate slowly and returned inside without a word. That evening, he filed a harassment complaint through his attorney, attaching a copy of the ADA compliance forms, the earlier city inspection, and photographs of the contents of the so-called hazardous containers. Trent submitted it directly to the state civil rights office. "She's getting sloppy," he said. "She's letting emotion take the wheel now. That's good. People like this make mistakes when they stop hiding behind procedure." But Karen still had one card left to play: the committee. At the end of the week, Lucas received a notice hand-delivered in an unmarked envelope. It wasn't from the city. It wasn't official, but it carried weight. The Neighborhood Visual Standards Advisory Committee. Another name, another invented body with no legal teeth but just enough faux authority to be dangerous, had voted unanimously to request that Lucas voluntarily redesign or remove any external installations not previously reviewed for visual conformity. No mandate. No law. Just pressure. Polite, soft-worded pressure. And it came with a final line that chilled him. "Failure to voluntarily cooperate may affect your future eligibility for participation in neighborhood programs and community services." Lucas stared at the page, then slowly, methodically folded it in, half, and dropped it into the trash. That same night, Karen's lights remained on well past midnight. He watched from his darkened living room, her silhouette pacing slowly behind the blinds, like a queen surveying her shrinking kingdom. She had expected compliance, a slow retreat, maybe even public embarrassment. What she had instead was resistance and silence. The next day, Lucas went on the offensive, not through aggression, not through confrontation, but through precision. He contacted the Department of Justice's regional ADA coordinator and filed an official federal inquiry. He submitted his inspection documents, copies of legal communications, photographs of the barriers, the zoning letters, the police incident, and the fabricated committee notices. He requested a formal evaluation of his neighborhood's practices and the potential systemic targeting of disabled residents through non-binding social policy. The wheels, once slow, began to turn. By the weekend, a notice was delivered to Karen's address and several others informing them of an upcoming federal audit regarding accessibility compliance and neighbor disputes. It wasn't an accusation. It was a warning, the kind that came on thick paper with an embossed seal and a date circled in red. But even that didn't stop her. Because just before midnight on Sunday, Lucas heard a noise outside, soft, repetitive, mechanical. He rolled quietly to the front window, peeked through the curtains, and froze. 2 men in dark jackets were installing a set of short metal posts into the sidewalk in front of his ramp. No identification. No city vehicle. One held a clipboard. The other operated a portable drill, anchoring what looked like a collapsible barrier into the concrete. Lucas didn't hesitate. He activated the floodlights, then called the non-emergency police line. By the time the squad car arrived, the men were gone, but the posts remained. Unfinished, half-sunk, sharp at the edges. Left like a threat. The responding officer was younger than the others, more alert. He examined the setup and frowned. "No permit on file for this," he said, "and these aren't city issue." He documented the scene and promised to forward the report to code enforcement. But Lucas knew the real message hadn't been for the city. It had been for him. And so, the next morning, he retaliated in the only way that made sense. He cleaned everything. He hired a crew to scrub the ramp, repaint the porch trim, plant fresh grass along the edges, and install solar pathway lights. He transformed the area from a battleground into a showcase. And then he invited the ADA compliance officer, the city accessibility coordinator, and a local journalist who specialized in disability rights to visit the site in person. He didn't tell Karen. He didn't tell anyone. But that afternoon, as they stood in front of his house taking notes and snapping photographs, Lucas watched through the window as Karen's curtains trembled. She was still watching, but now, so was everyone else. Karen didn't come out of her house for 2 full days after the unannounced visit by the ADA compliance officer and city officials. But Lucas knew better than to mistake her silence for surrender. It was the kind of pause predators make before lunging, stillness used as a strategy. She was waiting, not gone, and when she re-emerged on the 3rd day, it wasn't with apology or retraction, but with escalation. Lucas opened his door that morning to find a stack of city notices zip-tied to his railing, each marked with a different department seal, each a copy of some trivial complaint: water runoff, unauthorized lighting fixtures, noise disturbances from unspecified sources. The volume alone was absurd. 6 separate notices in total, printed, duplicated, and delivered by hand. The paper was stiff from morning dew, but the ink was fresh. She was playing a numbers game now, flooding the system with nuisance reports in hopes something would stick. Lucas brought them inside without a word, scanned each one, and forwarded the entire set to Trent and Merrill with a single-line subject: "She's back." Later that day, he wheeled himself down the ramp with deliberate precision and noticed something new. Someone had painted a line across the sidewalk in bright orange contractor's spray paint, directly in front of his property. It didn't connect to anything, wasn't labeled, but its placement was surgical, cutting his access path in half visually like a preamble to excavation. Lucas knew what it meant. Someone was laying the groundwork for a future restriction. It might take the form of a sidewalk narrowing, a reclassification of property use, or a sudden revision in zoning maps. Whatever the mechanism, the message was clear: this is not your space. You're tolerated, not welcome. He spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing legal filings with Trent, who now maintained a daily log of city correspondence on Lucas's behalf. "This is about forcing a mistake," Trent said, voice dry with fatigue. "She's pushing for an emotional reaction she can weaponize. You throw one pot, say one thing out of line, and they'll reframe this whole thing as a disruption caused by you. Stay measured. We're ahead." But Lucas had already decided there would be no emotional slip, no retaliation in anger. He had passed that point long ago. What he planned now wasn't born of frustration or even defiance. It was precision, intent, clarity. Because there were 2 things Karen hadn't accounted for: that her opponent had run out of fear, and that the one remaining thing he truly had to lose, his dignity, was now beyond her reach. That night, just before midnight, Lucas exited his house in silence and wheeled himself down the ramp. He moved slowly, methodically, gliding across the cement until the front wheels of his chair tapped against the now familiar blockade. Her 2 final planters, the heavy concrete ones she had not yet dared to remove. They sat like monuments to her arrogance, filled with dry soil and wilted stalks that hadn't seen water in weeks. Lucas locked his wheels, reached into his lap, and pulled out a collapsible steel bar, one used by movers to lever weight with minimal effort. With calm, measured motion, he wedged it beneath the lip of the first pot and began to rock. 1, 2, 3. With a dull scrape and shift of earth, the planter tipped. He repeated the motion with the second. It resisted slightly longer, but gravity and leverage did their work. When both were lying on their sides, soil spilling in uneven mounds, he unlocked his wheels and rolled forward. Across the street, Karen's porch light flicked on. Lucas didn't stop. He rolled past the ruined pots, continued to the curb, and crossed the road. The quiet hiss of his wheels over asphalt echoed against the parked cars. The night was thick, windless, and so quiet that even the creak of her wooden steps seemed like a crack of thunder when the door opened. Karen appeared in a pale robe, arms crossed over her chest as if trying to maintain control of something that had already slipped through her fingers. Her mouth opened to speak, but no words came. Lucas reached the foot of her porch, scooped up a shovel's worth of spilled planter soil from the pouch in his lap, packed tight into a canvas sack before he left, and without pause, tipped it upward into her mailbox. The dirt landed with a deep, hollow thud, followed by the dry scatter of pebbles and root bits. Karen's mouth moved again, but still no sound emerged. Lucas looked up at her without expression. He didn't smile, didn't sneer. He didn't need to. The action spoke for itself. Then he pivoted smoothly, wheeled back across the street, and disappeared into the house without a backward glance. The next morning, the neighborhood was humming with quiet tension. Nothing had been said officially, but everyone knew something had happened. The planters were gone before sunrise. Karen didn't stand on her porch that day, or the next. On the third day, Lucas received a letter, not from her, but from the city's compliance officer. It stated that, due to an ongoing legal dispute and federal review, all active community-led modifications or alterations near accessible pathways must cease immediately until resolution is reached. The wording was dry, but the meaning was unmistakable. He had won, not through outburst, but through pressure, consistency, and unflinching presence. That evening, as the sun dipped below the roofs and cast long shadows over the street, Lucas sat at the top of his ramp in silence, sipping coffee. The ramp was clean, clear, framed with solar lights and fresh edging, every line straight, every detail sharp. It wasn't just a structure anymore. It was territory. And he had held it. No one walked past him. No one interrupted. And across the street, behind a curtain that no longer stirred, Karen finally stayed quiet. And for the first time in months, the silence was his. In the weeks that followed, the air on Morrow Lane changed, slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, like the subtle shift in atmosphere before a coming storm clears and leaves behind stillness heavy with meaning. The hostile glances ceased, replaced by uncertain silence. No more flyers appeared on his door. No more city letters arrived with mysterious allegations about runoff or lighting. The sidewalk stayed clear, and the space around his ramp remained untouched. For the first time in nearly 3 months, Lucas could leave his house without preparing for confrontation or recording every inch of his exit. There were no new obstacles, no improvised fences, no fake beautification projects disguised as barriers. Even the ghost of her presence, Karen's rigid silhouette on the porch, vanished. Her blinds remained drawn now, day and night, her porch empty, her lawn beginning to yellow at the edges from neglect. The street hadn't changed, not visibly, but the texture of it had. It no longer resisted his presence. When the federal investigator concluded their inquiry, Lucas received a short letter, professional in tone, but direct in impact. The findings confirmed that the obstruction of his ramp had constituted a violation of access laws under ADA Title Class 2. No names were mentioned, but the implication was clear. The city's informal handling of neighbor disputes would now undergo review, and the so-called advisory committees had been flagged as potential tools of exclusion rather than community management. Karen was never cited publicly. That wasn't how these things worked. There were no public shaming rituals, no declarations of guilt, but people in small neighborhoods understood silence when it shifted. She stopped receiving invitations. Her name disappeared from the neighborhood bulletin. One day, the banner on her fence, Morrow Lane, clean and proud, was quietly taken down. Lucas never saw her directly again, not even at a distance. But one morning, a moving truck arrived and idled outside her house for nearly 6 hours. Boxes went in, a few pieces of patio furniture were loaded, and sometime in the afternoon, the garage door opened for the last time and swallowed her SUV like a final act. She left without fanfare. without farewell. No one waved. No one watched for long. The truck pulled out, and the street didn't look back. Her house stood empty for a while, windows blind and dark, its shutters still rigidly aligned as though clinging to the order she had tried so hard to impose. Lucas didn't celebrate. He didn't smile when he saw the "for sale" sign go up, didn't toast the end of the conflict or post a triumphant message. Victory didn't feel like victory when it came in silence. It felt like gravity easing off a long-held weight, like breath returning after weeks of restraint. He spent his days working, adjusting his home to better suit his needs, and maintaining the ramp not as a symbol of defiance anymore, but as a fact of life. A structure that belonged as naturally as the front door or the windows above it. He noticed other changes, too. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact began to nod again. Some pausing during morning walks to comment on the flowers planted near his porch, others offering short, cautious greetings. One man brought over a tray of tools, asking if Lucas needed anything repaired. A woman from 3 houses down left a note on his doorstep that read simply, "You handled everything with grace. Thank you for not leaving." It wasn't much, but it was something. Not approval, perhaps, but recognition. A quiet agreement that things had gone too far, and that those who had said nothing now understood the cost of that silence. One Saturday, Lucas spent the morning planting 3 large agave plants in the strip of dirt beside the ramp. They were sharp-edged, low maintenance, and visually striking, neither decorative nor hostile, but honest. A neighbor walking by asked if they were hard to maintain. Lucas replied that they mostly took care of themselves, just needed space and time to grow. That was enough. No more questions. At the base of the ramp, where the final planters had once stood like monuments of defiance, he placed a small stone with one word carved into it. Access. Not as a reminder of what he fought for, but of what he never should have had to fight for in the first place. No plaque, no story, just the word. Enough for anyone who looked closely. By mid-autumn, a young couple moved into Karen's old house. They waved the first day, introduced themselves on the second, and asked nothing about the past. Lucas welcomed them politely, offered them the name of a reliable electrician, and returned to his routine. He didn't warn them. He didn't need to. The street was different now. It had changed, not loudly, not radically, but permanently. Because when someone pushes for their place to exist fully and refuses to be erased, even the most rigid structures begin to bend. And once they bend, they never quite return to their original shape. And so the street remained quiet. The ramp remained solid. And Lucas, for the first time in a long time, no longer looked over his shoulder when he left his house. The war was over, not with an explosion, but with the sound of a gate creaking shut behind a moving truck, and the long, deep silence that follows when control gives way to consequence.